Alright, so we're here for part 2. In this part, I'm going to address some stuff about chassis tuning, right? So, part 1, we talked about, just getting a little bit of power in a little bit sooner, but before we go ahead and make that move, let's make sure that chassis is up for it, right? So, what I mean by chassis, when I say chassis, I mean suspension, right? So, suspension and the actual, cage and body and whatnot of the car. So, everything besides power, right? So, if you didn't notice, we came off of these edit tabs, and this is Drag Race 1. If you're unaware of how to modify this, I made some good videos on this previously, but I'll give you a quick glimpse. So if we click on this E tab right here where it says Edit Data Log Config, you've got the option to create as many different views as you'd like, right? So if you go down here to this little bar, you just click and drag them, right? So if we wanted fuel table percentage, fuel table 3 percentage, we just click and drag it, right? So you scroll over and there is tons of stuff. All of your, let's call it aftermarket, right? All of your additional sensor stuff is going to be after your advanced table. So don't just look at this and go, you go, well, where's my dome pressure sensor? Well, scroll over, right? So all this stuff is in here. This car is very sensor rich, has lots of stuff. Anyway, as you add all the things into the views that you want, you can name them however you want. Just name them whatever you want and then hit OK. And then it's going to ask you, you can save as, or don't save. I save these as, and then I name them different views. And if you wanted to look at different views, you would go to Edit, File, and then hit Open. And it'll bring you a bunch of different data log config views. So, I don't want you guys to look at all my customer list and stuff. So, anyway, we know how to do that. So let's get into it. Let's get over to chassis. So, let's look at some chassis data, right? So before we just go hammering it with a whole bunch more power and everything should be great and it's going to go 3 Gs and it's going to go 101 60 foot, we have to make sure the car is actually going to take it, right? So again, I keep harping on this, but it's important. Here's the release of the button. Here's where the car actually moved, right? So what did the car do? Again, I've got my x-axis, which the G-meter is one of the most important tools that you can have when it comes to tuning a high-powered drag race car. So G-meter I like to use the VPS because it gives you a whole bunch of data all at once, but the x-axis is invaluable, right? So let's bring up boost. We see we got a pretty easy, calm curve, okay? Let's look at pitch, which pitch is our front end, right? So here we are, the G-meter just set, right? So the tire just set. Pitch is still good to go. And the nose starts to come up out here, right? So the nose is snapping up, right? So this is the nose of the car coming upward. And it's leveling off. And it starts to decline, right? So that's because the back end of the car is going upward. And the back end of the car is coming upward more than the front end of the car, right? So it's starting to go nose down. Let's look at shocks, okay? So cars twist. If you're not aware of that, cars do twist. It'd be great if you could get your shock sensors to zero out in the same spot every single time, but they usually don't, especially after you've bumped the car into the beams. So let's look at a right rear shock and a right front shock. Actually, let's do left. So notice my scaling. Okay, so when I clicked on this, it says 0 to 6 inches, which is good for left front, but left rear says 0 to 1500. So we have to change that scaling. So I like to set the scaling the same, right? So we know we're monitoring 6 inches of movement here, okay? So the left rear shock, yes, the rear shock is moving a heck of a lot more than the front, right? We're only looking at the 60 foot right now. So when we let go of the trans brake, and hopefully you can see that, if we double click this, style, left rear shock, change this to in your face blue, there we go, can't miss it. So the left rear shock, we let go of the trans brake button right here. The car, see how the car is loaded, right? So like if you're if you think about the way the rear end moves, right? If it's set up to be on a radial, this is literally the rear suspension kind of snatching, right? So like this is the tire like loading up against the racetrack surface, and the tire is biting, and while the tire is biting, it's doing this right here, right? And the suspension's being loaded, and the shock is holding it. If you got a good shock, right? If you have a good rear shock, it's the suspension's holding it, and then mechanically it's starting to separate. Okay, so the way I looked at the first thing I like to look at for shock travel, and this is beyond just 60-foot tuning, is I like to look at its total movement, right? So let's minimize this, right? And we look for its total movement. So we started down here, left shock at 1.13 inches, and it peaks up here at 5.24 inches, right? So this thing's moving a little over 4 inches in the back end, okay? So if you wanted to, you can look at these as well. So the minimum is 1.03 and the maximum is 5.31, right? So you can, it's a quick reference tool here to look at in order to find out what the peak is and what the minimum is, right? So we start here down at 1.13 and we are peaking all the way out here at the shift, which is what I want. All right, that's what I'm looking for. I want it to peak as far out as I can, right? As we want to keep that rear shock as tight as we can without being too tight to cause the tire to spin. These shock settings come from Menser and from years of experience of my own of the way I like to do things, right? So something interesting to look at chassis tuning wise, right? So this is fun. You can see this. Let's get rid of this, and let's get rid of this, and let's get rid of this left rear shock. This is the right front. This is the left front shock, right here. This line here. So the left front shock hits the limiter out here. So the left front shock hits the limiter a little bit after where the right or the left rear shock stops and peaks, right? But this line here is front wheel speed. So you see this front wheel speed, and my front wheel speed is actually on the right front. So if we scale that, it's on the right front tire. So if we scale that, look at that. See how that corresponds right here? So see, both of these shocks are doing the same thing. They're bouncing, right? It's skipping the tire. So that front tire is skipping after the gear change. Is that a little sketchy? Probably. But this is where this car really performs well, right? So this car does well by, having that rear shock, topped out and kind of laying over. We look at the left rear shock again. So it peaks here and it's starting to come back down. We're starting to get some G-force, or some force being pushed on the back end of the car, down force pushed it on the back of the car, and it's starting to compress that rear shock. But look at what that front's doing. That front tire is kind of bobbling, right? So it's hitting, it's bouncing. The front shock is doing this. The front strut's doing the same thing, and it's slowly starting to compress. And look at how much that rear shock is compressed by the time we hit the end of the racetrack, right? We're back down to 3.28 inches, right around the stripe. And we got a front wheel speed of 205, 209-ish, whatever, 209 mile an hour, something like that. So this thing chassis-wise is doing exactly what I want it to do, right? I want it to come up here, drag out the peak as long as we can, and then have it start to compress back down. So when it comes to chassis tuning, this thing will take more power, right? This will take more power. This rear shock is tight enough where it'll take more power. Now, if you're looking at your own shock data and you see that you let go of the button and the rear shock just peaks before a second into the run, you need to tighten up that rear shock. If the rear shock is full tight, you need to find a new shock guy or a better pair of shocks or whatever, right? Because what happens is when the majority of the time, I shouldn't say just what happens like as if it's a blanket statement, but the majority of the time what happens is people put a whole bunch of anti-squat in a car and they get the car to peak early, right? So the rear end of the car peaks early. It's got tons of anti-squat. And then when it tops the shock out, it doesn't have enough wheel speed and it winds up zipping the tire, right? So if we look at drive shaft, here's drive shaft, right? And let's remove front wheel speed so we can see drive shaft a little better. Look at what drive shaft's doing. We're just about losing the drive shaft here, right? So we're literally just about losing the drive shaft out here because it peaked out here at 130-ish mile an hour, and the back tire got light. It's not driving the tire down into the concrete as hard, you know. So when that rear suspension peaks, the back tire gets light, and when the back tire gets light, it tends to spin. So I explained this 100 times, but look at this as if this right here is an oil slick, right? If you're driving down the road in your truck or your car or whatever, you're just your daily driver, and you hit an oil slick at 10 mile an hour and you put your foot flat to the floor in oil, it's going to spin, right? But if you go through that oil slick and you've already had your foot flat to the floor, you've already reached peak power, peak torque, whatever it is, and you're zinging through that oil slick at 130 mile an hour, you're a hell of a lot less likely to spin that tire going through the oil when you're already accelerating so fast early or prior to hitting it, right? When you try to apply a ton of power right where that tire gets light, it spins. So another thing I see a lot of guys have problems with is they put a bunch of anti-squat in a car. It peaks at 1 second into the run, or right around 1 second into the run. The converter's pulling the motor down, right? Pulling the motor down hard, and then it spins the tire. There's too many things happening all at once, right? So the converter's pulling the motor down, which is going to make this thing less likely to want to stay planted. But then it's also peaking the rear shock at the same time. And when the rear shock peaks at the same time, the ass end of the car gets really light, right? So be mindful of that. All this kind of stuff plays into effect. But by looking at this rear shock data here, I can tell that this car will take more power early, all right? So this thing will take more power early, and we're probably going to want to, when we start getting really aggressive with it, this peak is going to come back, right? So if we were to apply more power sooner, this peak at 3 seconds into the run is probably going to fall back into the 2.5 range. If this peak falls in the 2.5 range, this same bell curve is going to happen. It's just going to happen more aggressively and earlier, right? So that's the way shock works, is it's dampening the extension in this case, or the compression in the case of a slick or whatever. So we want that shock to work the whole way, right? But understand that if we hit this thing mechanically with more power, it's going, this line here, this 3 second peak is going to happen back here at 2.5. And if it happens at 2.5, this rear shock at 1 is going to be somewhere like it is here, right? So we're going to continue to extend earlier and earlier. So when we could, if we had the gearing in this car to eventually be able to apply enough power early, we would get into a spin situation because this rear shock is going to start topping out too soon, if that makes sense. So chassis data is very, very important. Shock data is important. X-axis is very important. But again, we can look at that X-axis and we know, look, if the X-axis peaks here, it's peaking around here, this is not where we want to top the shock out. So we want to top the shock out when it's on the downward, hill. I like to top the rear shock out after the G meters peaked, after the converters pulled the motor down, and after the engine starts to accelerate upward. So hopefully this gives you guys some insight to some radial tuning stuff. This is, again, it's all subjective. It's all relative to the combination at hand, but understand that more data is not bad, okay? So take it for what it's worth. My next move on this thing is going to be, let's back this up with boost and, get the boost in faster to this thing, try to get a little bit of this lull out of it, try to keep this G meter up a little bit higher, and try to get that rear shock to come back to me a little bit further, and see if we can't get the car to 60 foot a little bit better. So, all right, hopefully y'all learned something and it was useful. See you.